Thank you so much for joining us. Today we are going to discuss many philosophical questions. And I'd like to start with the following. You are a renowned physicist, an expert in space exploration, and at the same time, an expert on problems that we now have on Earth, and an activist in those spheres. My first question is a rather fundamental one. What do you think is more important, solving problems on Earth or colonizing other planets?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily in the long run an either or question. I think working to put people in space is not going to um, make it impossible to deal with the problems on Earth. However, I do think that there's been a lot of hype, a lot of discussion about human exploration of space. I think it's a long way off before we colonize any other parts of space in any real way. Space exploration is incredibly expensive, incredibly dangerous, and I think a lot of the discussion about going beyond government sending a few astronauts into space is really unrealistic. So I think we really have to. It's in the near term, as far as humanity is concerned, it's much more important to focus on dealing with the problems here on Earth. At the same time, allowing governments to do exploration and research and development, and slowly develop the tools to go to the moon and Mars. But that's going to be decades, and I think in the near term, all of this discussion about sending many people to Mars is really science fiction and not science.
So, what's your forecast? You said decades. You think in several decades we will be able to colonize Mars or Venus?
I'm agnostic about it. I think it's going to be much harder than people say, much more expensive than people say. I think in the long term, and I mean really long term, centuries, we can imagine having colonies on other planets and or the moon or Mars. I don't see that as a panacea. I don't see that as a way to resolve the problems we have here on Earth. I see it as an important stepping stone for humanity in the long term to hedge its bets, because it's good to, if something disastrous happens to the Earth, if an asteroid hits the Earth or something like that, it's nice to have a colony somewhere else. But I think in terms of being a solution for any major problems here on Earth, a small colony on another planet is not going to make much difference.
Okay, so let's talk about the Earth then. You recently wrote a book called Physics of Climate Change, and that's probably one of the most important problems here on Earth. Are you optimistic about this issue? Will we be able to solve it in time to save the planet?
Well, again, I want to step back. I think climate change is happening. It's already started to happen, and we've already impacted on the climate, and there's not much we can do to change what we've already done in the near term. But we shouldn't act as if suddenly climate change is going to destroy all life or destroy the planet. It's a slow and evolving process. It will cause problems, and it's causing problems now. Whether we can address it as a global society, it depends on the day. Some days I'm optimistic, some days I'm not so optimistic. The real issue is not a technological problem, it's a political problem and a sociological problem. We have the ability technologically to reduce the carbon output of much of the planet, but whether we can begin to act globally as a civilization is the real question. We've already seen with the pandemic how difficult it is to coordinate the responses of many countries, and we have to begin to think globally as human beings on a single planet, beyond our countries, beyond our national borders, and we're not used to that as society, as a species. I think it's really going to require a change of thinking, but I'm not a doomsday. I don't think. I think we will address many of the problems of climate change without necessarily solving the underlying problem of carbon. We'll need to learn how to deal with raising temperatures, with rising sea levels, which are already, in some sense, in stone. We've already put in the last 25 years, we put as much heat into the oceans due to the additional carbon in the atmosphere as I think about 3.4 billion Hiroshima level atomic bombs. We've already, no matter what we do, ocean levels are going to rise about a quarter to a half a meter over this century. And that's going to affect people around the world, and we'll have to deal with that problem. It's not global apocalypse in the sense of destroying all of human civilization. It's going to produce hardships, but we know it's going to happen in a sense. And if we're intelligent, we can begin to mediate those issues, mediate those problems. I think I said in the book that the future is charging at us like a freight train, but it's doing so on tracks that we have built. So we can, in principle, if we're intelligent enough and willing to deal with these issues, begin to move the tracks over so the crane doesn't crash into us. I think there's many things we can do. So I'm not pessimistic about the future. I think it's going to be a challenge, and we need to deal with it. And I think, unfortunately, there are going to be a number of problems, and I wish we as a global society had begun to address these issues earlier. It would have been easier. But I'm hoping one of the reasons I wrote that book is that governments don't tend to lead, they tend to follow. And if the public becomes sufficiently informed about the challenges and the risks of the future, then I think any government will begin to respond. That's the government's work. If the public is sufficiently concerned, ultimately any government, no matter what type of government you have, will respond, because they need to in order to keep the support of the public.
But as you just said, to move the tracks of that train, countries of the whole world would need to unite. Isn't that a utopian idea, given that countries have their own political interests? And you might say that currently it's also in the interests of any country, citizens of any country in the world, to stop global warming, to curb emissions. But, for example, some countries do not join international treaties in that area and do not do anything special for that.
You're right, it's a challenge, and no country is going to solve this problem on its own in an easy way, I think. Unfortunately, I think what is likely to happen is it's got to get to the point the negative features of climate change are sufficiently dramatic that each country realizes it's in each of the countries that has the resources to do something about it. And by that I mean the developed world right now. Those countries realize that they have no choice but to deal with it. Unfortunately, the way climate change is working is that while the developed world is largely responsible for the problem, the less developed world is going to be deal with the consequences. Over the equatorial regions, it's likely that higher temperatures will exist for longer and more stable periods, and be much more difficult. The impacts there will be much more severe, and those countries tend to be poorer countries and less able to deal with it. I think, once again, it's hard to imagine the developed world acting in an altruistic, generous way towards the third world until they realize that millions or hundreds of millions of climate refugees present a problem, and then we'll realize it's in their own self-interest to deal with it. There is one possible route where a single country could have an impact globally. I'm beginning to think it's more and more likely, and that is potentially the possibility for what's called geoengineering, where you send aerosols into the atmosphere as a way to reduce the energy coming in from the sun, reflect more of it into space. Now, that's the kind of thing that one nation could be involved with, which is a little scary in some sense, because that means it won't be a global decision to do that. On the other hand, it could be done. And the good news is, the things that makes it a little less scary for me, is that while carbon exists in the atmosphere for almost 1,000 years, the carbon that we've put up there as a civilization, literally probably already about 500 billion tons of carbon over the entire era since the Industrial Revolution. Much of that will remain in the atmosphere for a millennium, for 1,000 years, and we'll have to deal with that. But aerosols that we put in the atmosphere to try and reduce the solar energy coming in, those exist in the atmosphere only for about a year or two. So if it's put into the atmosphere and causes problems, as it could easily do, at least those problems won't be long-lived. But that's one possibility that may present itself, and I suspect some countries may be desperate enough to consider doing that ultimately. And that's an example of where one country could globally affect the situation. Otherwise, I think necessity is the mother of invention, and I hope we don't get to the point where things are desperate enough and the effects of climate change are severe enough that countries have no choice but to do this because of mass climate migration, refugees, lots of things that could happen. But we'll see. It's one of those things we'll have to see about. It's a long-term problem. It's a problem that's not going to happen we're not going to suddenly, the world's not suddenly going to end this decade or next decade. It's kind of like a frog in boiling water, as they say. When you heat the water up, the frog doesn't notice it a little bit more, or you heat it up a little bit more. And the question is, at what point will humanity globally recognize that the water is beginning to boil? Not literally, but metaphorically.
Yeah, let's hope that this happens sooner rather than later. As for geoengineering,
Well,
that is
yeah,
a fascinating concept. Do we already have the necessary technologies to do what you mentioned about aerosols?
Yeah, probably we do, and people are looking into it, and that research is going on in a number of countries. And I used to be a big opponent of geoengineering, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, because I thought that there are better ways to try and address it by producing less carbon and even considering carbon capture in the atmosphere. That's another solution that people are looking at. It's a very difficult problem to solve, to remove the carbon that we've already put in the atmosphere. But again, some research is necessary for that. But dumping aerosols in the atmosphere is certainly not beyond the technological power of the world right now, or any country. And I suspect likely to be one of the things that is done if the impacts of climate change become more severe. Some countries will be driven to consider that. And as I say, I'm not as worried as I used to be, because of the fact that I now recognize that if there are unintended consequences of that, that at least they won't last decades or centuries. But it's not an alternative to dealing with the problem of carbon production. And once again, I say we have the technologies to reduce that too, in many ways. And so it's a matter of political will more than technological will.
What are other problems that you deem the most important right now on Earth that we should fight as soon as possible? Maybe some existential risks for the humanity.
Well, there's one existential risk that's been facing humanity on a much more severe level, in a way, for 70 years, and that's nuclear weapons. Your country and the United States have between them about 10,000 nuclear weapons, which is ridiculous. It's absurd. It's unnecessary for any rational purpose. And unlike climate change, a nuclear war of any magnitude could dramatically and quickly affect all of civilization, and in principle, of course, even end civilization. It's the most severe existential risk, I think, that humanity faces, and there's no rational reason for the number of nuclear weapons we have. Each of those, your country and the United States, have about 1,000 nuclear weapons on trigger alert right now, back from the Cold War, where again there's no reason for that, where a mistaken sensor could begin to trigger a nuclear war. We're very lucky that there has not been a nuclear accident in the 75 years or so since nuclear weapons were last used against a civilian population. But it's a concern. It's one of the reasons why for a decade I chaired what's called the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which every year sets the doomsday clock. The purpose being to get humanity to recognize this existential risk, and it's a severe one. There are, of course, other emerging risks from technology. As we're seeing now with the pandemic, which may or may not have the origins in a government research lab. We don't know, but it's certainly possible that biotechnology can produce risks that impact on humans. I don't see them as producing risks that are going to destroy human life. But as you can see, even a pandemic with something in some sense as mild as the coronavirus has already impacted globally the world economy in a significant way. And so biotechnological risks persist. And some people think in the long run that the risks of artificial intelligence impacting on the way our society works is severe. Right now, I'm making the logical assumption that you're real and not a creation of a computer program. But we've seen how easy it is to affect images, produce false news, and that kind of impact again can be dramatic. And so we have to be. It's not as if these things should make us too afraid to get out of bed in the morning, but we have to recognize that they are real risks, and we need to keep our eyes open and be willing to address them in realistic ways.
You mentioned risks connected with the development of artificial intelligence. Do you agree with experts such as Nick Bostrom or Eliezer Yudkowsky, who claim that someday we will develop a super intelligent artificial general intelligence that will overpower and outsmart humans and will rule the world, and that this may even pose an existential risk to us all?
Well, it's certainly a possibility. I'm not as concerned, again, an apocalyptic future that comes from that. We will look, computers and artificial intelligence are already affecting us in ways that control us in many ways. I mean, the simplest example is very trivial. It's an elevator. You get in an elevator and you trust that the elevator is going to take you where it says it's going to take you. You have no control over the situation, but you assume that the artificial intelligence, if you wish, in that elevator is going to work. And so we as a society have already begun to give up certain, if you want, control that we might have had before, but it hasn't destroyed civilization. Things will change. Computers will become more intelligent, and maybe one day they will be self-aware and conscious. We don't even know what that is. But I'm not so sure that, once again, that will produce an apocalyptic future. It will just change the future. We will adapt to that in new ways. I wrote something once, an example that maybe should give us some historical perspective. In I guess the 5th or 6th century BC, Plato and others were very worried that the development of written language would destroy storytelling, because people would no longer have memories to tell stories. They'd be able to rely on books, if you want. And they were certain that new technology would destroy the storytelling, but of course it didn't. It just changed it dramatically, and many of us would think it would improve it. So it's a reality that computers are becoming more capable of dealing with problems. On the other hand, I think it's a long way out. I think claims about an imminent singularity, an imminent superintelligence coming in the near term are again overstated, just as overstated as the idea that we're going to have a colony on Mars in the next decade. Computers, there's many things computers are good at. There are other things that they're not. Maybe they can drive cars very well at some point. But right now, as far as I know, we don't have a robot that could even fold laundry very effectively.
Previously, people used to say that a computer would never beat a human in chess or Go, and look at the current times.
Well, computers are very good at chess and Go, but that's very different than dealing with the many problems that are involved with being human. The things we do on in every moment, the decisions we make, the actions we make are incredibly complex. And let me give you an example of how the way the human brain works is a mystery, still in many ways. I mean, obviously we've learned a lot, but let me give you a physics example. Right now, to take the kind of computing power and storage that is comparable to the human brain, if you used a normal computer, would require a power of something like 10 terawatts, which is almost the amount of power that all of humanity uses. The human brain uses about 10 watts. It's a million times less energy to compute. And so there's clearly some massive difference right now in the way we analyze information and the way computers do. And so there's a long way to go, I think, before we can imagine computers being able to, if you want, replace us in every way. There'll be many areas of human activity that computers could replace us in right now. I mean, for example, even in medical diagnostics, for example, computers are great at storing information and sifting through it. And so if there's a medical problem presented, computers would be very good and potentially better than humans at diagnosing medical problems. So there'll be many areas of what I guess I'm more worried about than humans becoming enslaved in some tyranny like the Terminator or some other science fiction apocalyptic view. I'm more worried about the fact that we won't use computers effectively to help improve our society, but instead diminish it. Computers are going to replace humans in many areas of the workforce, and that's just going to happen. And it's an inevitable future that I see. Now we can imagine two possible futures. We can imagine one where people are out of work and starving, or we could imagine one where we use that and allow ourselves more free time to we use the fact that computers can help us produce the resources necessary for humans to live and function effectively, and we can spend time at coffee shops, listening to music, reading books, and so we can make our lives better. And so we have a choice, once again, in how to use the technologies that are developing. One, to allow all of the resources to be cornered by a few individuals or companies that control computer resources, or distribute that vast wealth over all of humanity and allowing all of us to live actually lives that we might really wish to have, where we can do the kind of things we want to do and let the computers do the things we don't want to do.
Yeah, I think this scenario is appealing to most of us. Well, since you are an astrophysicist and a cosmologist, let's return to space from Earth. I cannot avoid the question of UFOs, since there has been recently much hype about photos of UFOs in 1950s, supposedly visiting the Earth, revealed by the US government. Do you think that those were aliens, and that aliens ever visited us or will visit us?
I wrote a piece saying whatever they are, they're not aliens. I think what's been revealed are not images of aliens visiting us. They're things that cannot be easily explained, or for which we have so little data that we can't identify the objects in the atmosphere. But I've written about this extensively. If you think about the challenges of interstellar space travel, they're so extreme. Are visiting us. It would take almost the energy output of a star to power a ship to be able to travel at near the speed of light, which you'd have to do to travel across solar systems. And there's, if your star light years away, it takes light years to get between solar systems, and you can imagine it would take centuries to travel between solar systems. The power output that's required is immense, and it's hard to imagine that some civilization would basically devote power that's comparable to all of the energy that all of humanity uses right now to send a spaceship here that would hide or do weird kinky experiments on people. That's very difficult to imagine. Plus, giving evidence of our existence as a technological civilization for a century or so with our radio waves and sound waves. And so what the motivation would be, it's hard to imagine any intelligent civilization that's less than maybe 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 light years away. Such a civilization at best would have just gotten the signal right now. It's hard to imagine that they would have amassed this incredible project to come visit us. And not even that. We are already listening for signs of other civilizations, but it's very, very difficult. The galaxy is a big place. I remember I have cable TV, and once I got cable TV and there were 200 channels, I gave up watching TV to some extent because I could never find what I wanted. In the real universe, there are an infinite number of frequencies to listen to, and what signal to listen to, what frequency to listen to. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. So even learning about the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations, even if they exist, and we don't know if they do, is a challenge. And much less going actually to visit. If extraterrestrial civilizations that are intelligent exist,
even if the aliens have learned about us, they live too far away to even have started preparing for takeoff in our direction, or maybe they are on their way in the.
well, just think what we would do. Well, no. Just look, what would we do if we got a signal of an extraterrestrial civilization? What would we do? I think about it. If we got such a signal, the first thing we'd spend a lot of time trying to figure out what we should do, and probably the first thing we might try and do is communicate with such a. First of all, we might decide best not to communicate. Okay, best to hide. Okay, but and that's a reasonable response. But if we did want to reach out, we would probably first communicate by all the ways we can normally communicate, rather than try and launch a mission that might take centuries or millennia that's beyond the resource capabilities of our civilization. It's the least likely way that we would communicate with aliens, and I think that the reverse is true too.
The Earth is our home. Thanks, our home. Let's go to another one. It's a quote. In Russian, it rhymes. So, what do you think about this quote?
It's a really important point that people don't leave home easily. And I think the notion that we're going to want to leave Earth, unless Earth becomes uninhabitable, it's unlikely. People don't emigrate easily unless where they live is unbearable. We see refugees leaving home because they have no other choice. But most people like home. They like the comforts of home. They like what's familiar. Most of us would rather make where we live a better place. And I think we can do that. And I think that is the highest priority.
Well, maybe in the worst case scenario, if those problems that we discussed turn out to be worse than we expected, and the Earth becomes a worse place to live in, maybe then we will act more proactive.
Yeah, maybe that may drive us into space. And that's absolutely true. We may be driven into space because the Earth may be so unbearable. But once again, just like people who have pioneered and gone out, the first pioneers who crossed the Atlantic and lived in North America did not have an easy life. If you think the Earth is going to be uncomfortable, it's not going to be anywhere near as uncomfortable as Mars. Mars is not a pleasant place to live in, and even though it might be livable, it's going to be if you want to think about a comparison, Mars right now, of course, is unlivable unless you create an artificial environment locally. And so even it will take a long time before the Earth is as unlivable as Mars.
What do you think will be the next step in this industry? Maybe tours to the moon?
I think the next step will be that a number of countries, including the United States and Russia and China and maybe India, and other countries, will put human stations on the moon. I think that's going to happen in the next decade or so. And by human, I mean local stations which have a few well-trained astronauts who live there and demonstrate that there can be a continuing presence on a moon base. That may happen in the next 10 or 20 years. But I think the notion that general people are going to be traveling through space is largely a fantasy. We've seen, sure, yes, in the last weeks, we've seen a few billionaires travel, but they haven't really gone into space. They've gone on these little carnival rides of 7 or 8 minutes where they touch the edge of space and come down. And even that costs millions of dollars. But the logistics of sending even a billionaire into orbit around the Earth is an incredibly expensive proposition and an incredibly dangerous one. And let me give you an example. The US space shuttle was perhaps one of the most well-tested devices you could imagine. and it went on over 100 missions to space and back. 2% of the people that went up on that space shuttle died. If 2% of the people who flew on airplanes died, airplanes wouldn't be flying. And space is expensive and dangerous. So much as people rave about the idea of space tourism, it's a much more difficult proposition than most people suggest. And I think while it will happen to some extent, people are going to die. And I hate to say it that way, but the first people that do, then you'll get the lawyers involved and the lawsuits and it's going to, so I don't see the era of space tourism to the moon as something that's likely to happen. Yes, maybe a few billionaires will circle the moon, maybe, but the logistics of a moon mission are immense and the costs are immense, many billions of dollars. And I don't see the business model that allows the kind of profit that would make private industry effective in that regard. Sure, for going around the Earth and maybe near Earth travel, we've already seen SpaceX and other private companies are useful for that. But for space exploration, I think we're going to need governments, and governments that are willing to spend tens of billions of dollars to do that. So I don't see it becoming anything more in the near term than government-supported research and exploration.
But doesn't space travel get cheaper and less risky with every coming and passing year? For example, let's take Elon Musk's SpaceX and its business model and its plans to launch a huge spaceship to Mars with many people. I think the projected costs per person are estimated to be several $100,000, if I'm not mistaken. So quite affordable for not billionaires, but also millionaires and maybe middle class even.
You also heard that rocket ship would be available years before it was. I think we have to take a lot of these claims with a grain of salt. Yes, space travel is going to become cheaper. It already is. SpaceX is sending things into space for less money than it used to cost. But there are certain physical limitations. There's certain physical requirements to get up to a speed of 11 kilometers per second to escape the Earth's atmosphere. And so, yes, I suspect it's not going to cost, in the long term, it's not going to cost tens of billions of dollars to send things into space. It may cost only hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's not going to be, or maybe only tens of millions of dollars. But it's not going to be like computers, where computers have become cheaper and cheaper exponentially. The computer that I'm using to talk to you right now has more memory than the biggest computer. 40 years ago, at the university I worked at, I had the biggest hard drive on the university to do the scientific work I would do. It was a 1 gigabyte hard drive. It cost $25,000. Now I can get a 1 gigabyte hard drive for $1. It's amazing, but that's technology that's at the cutting edge. But I know Elon Musk, and I visited his SpaceX factory, and he's given me a tour. And as he himself said to me, it's not rocket science. Rockets are basic technology. There's nothing ultra fancy about them. They're really basic, fundamental technology, and that technology has not changed a lot in the last 50 or 60 years. Those fundamental aspects, those kind of costs are going to go down by maybe a factor of 2 or maybe a factor of 10, but not a factor of 1,000,000. And therefore, I think anything in the near term, to imagine doing this in the near term, is science fiction. Yes, maybe in the extremely long term, there'll be enough of an infrastructure developed so that we can imagine sending regular people into space easily, but I don't see that happening in the coming decade, and I certainly don't. Even though I know Elon Musk, I certainly don't expect he's really going to be sending people to Mars. In my lifetime and likely his lifetime, I think that's a fantasy. He doesn't think so, and maybe I'm wrong. We'll see.
You said that you are agnostic about perspectives in some areas of humankind development, but overall, in general, are you optimistic about our future?
Well, once again, it depends on the day. I think in the end, I am. I think we as we continue to explore the universe, we are continuing to be surprised. And every day, I like to say I'm surprised if I'm not surprised. So I'm always eager for the next new thing. And you've asked me throughout this program to make predictions, and I must admit, I don't like making predictions about the near-term future because they always miss the most important things. I don't mind predicting the future of the universe 1 trillion years from now because I can do that, and also even if I'm wrong, no one's going to be around to check my predictions. But if you look at science fiction, all those people who call themselves futurists, when someone calls themselves a futurist, I usually stop listening because we always miss the most important new developments because they're surprises. In the 1950s, when I used to listen, or 60s, when I used to watch science fiction, I'd see flying cars. Today I was, if the world of the 21st century would be full of flying cars and people doing all these things that aren't happening. But no one, or very few people, talked about something like the internet, which has changed civilization more than anything else. We don't have flying cars, but I can talk to you, and I can do things that affect my daily life in ways that are much more profound than a flying car. So I suspect I like to be optimistic because I think the future is full of surprises. And so I think the next big thing is something that I can't envisage and that you can't envisage. And I like to tell people, if I knew what the next big thing was, I'd be doing it right now.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thanks for your insights. I hope that our future will be bright and we will get over all the current crises existing on Earth. And maybe someday we'll reach out to space. Thank you.